Hey guys, we are now well within the month of October, and so that means that the 2022 governor elections are becoming more and more competitive. And over the last week, we've gotten a ton of new polls in just the last 7 days. Polls from some of the most competitive races of the year to some races that really shouldn't be as close as the polls are suggesting they are. In fact, Joy Hofmeister, a Democrat, is leading against incumbent Kevin Stitt in the state of Oklahoma, and there was also a second poll released earlier this week that showed Hofmeister in the lead, and so we're definitely going to take a look at Oklahoma a bit closer in this video, but also all of the other races in which we've seen new polls from over the last 7 days. And so today we'll be taking a look at the latest polls released for the 2022 governor elections and what they mean for the races in November. And so we're going to start off with the election in Ohio. This is the most recent poll we've gotten this week, and Mike DeWine leads over Nan Whaley by 22%. Another poll showing Mike DeWine ahead by over 20 points, despite only winning by 3 points in 2018. So Mike DeWine is in a much better position than he was in 4 years ago, and the average has him ahead by 17.8%. Nan Whaley isn't too well known of a Democratic candidate at all, and so Mike DeWine will easily win his re-election to a second term in office. However, Republicans are seriously struggling in the Senate race in the Buckeye State, as Tim Ryan actually leads by 0.3% against J.D. Vance, which means that right now, Republicans are expected to do over 18% better in the gubernatorial election than in the Senate election, and Ohio is not a solid red state. It's more of a likely Republican state, and so that 18-point margin could make a huge difference in determining whether or not J.D. Vance will be elected to the Senate to succeed Rob Portman. And so if you look at the latest poll conducted by Signal, J.D. Vance leads by 2 points. But in that same poll released for the governor race, Mike DeWine is ahead by 22 points, which means that according to this poll, Mike DeWine is outperforming Vance by 20%. And Mike DeWine is probably not going to win by 22%. And so this means that if Mike DeWine does worse than a 20-point margin, J.D. Vance is going to lose to Tim Ryan, at least according to this one poll, and so I really think that the gap is increasing at this point, which may spell defeat for J.D. Vance in the upcoming Senate election, and if Republicans lose in Ohio, they're guaranteed to lose the Senate races overall, which means Democrats will maintain their majority. But in that gubernatorial election, it will stay red, as Mike DeWine is on a very good track to winning re-election. Next up, in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham leads by 8 and 16 points, according to the two latest polls against Mark Ronchetti. And Lujan Grisham really isn't the best governor. She's pretty unpopular, and despite winning by 14 points in 2018, she has since had a sexual misconduct allegation put out against her, and that has had a major impact on her popularity statewide. But recent polls do show that Michelle Lujan Grisham is on track to winning re-election. At one point, her margin in the polls was just 1.4%, but now it's a pretty healthy 9.1% lead against Ronchetti. Ronchetti is not a bad candidate. He's a pretty good nominee for the Republicans. He did pretty well in 2020, but it's still not going to be enough to defeat the incumbent Democrat. Right now, I have Michelle Lujan Grisham in the best position she's been in since this election started, and so I have New Mexico as a likely Democratic state. In Nebraska, Jim Pillen is only ahead by 7 points against his Democratic counterpart, Carol Blood. And so this election is to succeed the incumbent Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts, who was reelected by 18 points in 2018. And so with Jim Pillen being somebody that has not been governor of Nebraska in the past, it is reasonable to believe that he's not going to win by as solid of a margin as Ricketts would have. But the surprising thing about this poll is that despite it being funded by a Republican sponsor, Jim Pillen is only ahead by 7% in a state that Donald Trump won in 2020 by 19.2%. And so overall, Nebraska is not the most Republican state in the country. There are definitely many states that are more red, but it is still almost impossible for a Democrat to win any statewide races in Nebraska. The only time they can win is in presidential elections, where Joe Biden in 2020 carried the 2nd congressional district and won its one electoral vote. And so overall in Nebraska, we're going to see a race that's probably going to be closer than the one 4 years ago in 2018, and that's why I'm moving Nebraska out of the solid Republican column and into the likely Republican column, as I just don't think that Jim Jim Pillen is going to win by over 15% to his first term in office. And now we have that poll from Oklahoma that I talked about earlier with Joy Hoffmeister in the lead over incumbent Governor Kevin Stitt. And just look at the polling average for this race over the last month. At the very beginning of September, Kevin Stitt led by 13.8%. Considering just how red of a state Oklahoma is, this margin wasn't even good. For comparison, Donald Trump won Oklahoma by 33 points in 2020 and by 36 points in 2016. But in this governor race, Kevin Stitt now leads by just 5.1%. I mean, his polling average has been falling pretty significantly. We've seen some polls with Stitt only ahead by 3 and 1%, as well as 2 polls, none of them conducted by Democrats, showing Joy Hoffmeister ahead by 4 and 1%. However, there was a poll conducted by Kevin Stitt's very own campaign that put him up by a solid margin. So even a poll conducted by his own campaign can barely show him ahead by a solid margin. I'm not going to keep Oklahoma in the solid Republican column, especially considering the fact that in 2018, Kevin Stitt only won by 12 points. So in Oklahoma, I'm going to have this race categorized as likely Republican, just like Nebraska. And one of the main reasons is because Joy Hoffmeister is a former Republican, and she changed her party, I believe, just a year ago, which means that she is much more moderate of a Democrat than many other nominees you're seeing around the country. Next up, we have one of the most competitive races of the year in one of the most competitive states in the country right now, and that, of course, is the race in Wisconsin. Tony Evers is running for re-election against Tim Michels, and the latest CBS News poll has them in a dead heat. Tim Michels is the Republican nominee. He is really not too well known across the state, but among the Republican Party, he has pandered a little bit to Donald Trump, but he did not receive the endorsement of the former president. Trump did not make an endorsement for this race, but Tony Evers was elected in 2018, defeating Scott Walker, who is running for a third term. But this time, he is in a year and an environment that is significantly less favorable to his own party, and so winning re-election will be very, very difficult. In fact, the polls only have him ahead by 0.4%. At his largest margin, he was ahead by 2.7%, but that was never going to happen. This race is probably going to be decided by less than 1% for either Tony Evers or Tim Michels. As the incumbent, Tony Evers does have an advantage, but no Democrat has won a gubernatorial race in Wisconsin with a Democratic president in the White House since 1962, and the polls show either Tim Michels or Tony Evers ahead by very small margins, or it's just a complete tie. So right now, Wisconsin is going to be one of the closest races of the year, and I will categorize it as tilt Democratic because Tony Evers is a popular governor, and as the incumbent, he is still slightly favored, along with the fact that Democrats are really not doing as poorly in Wisconsin as initially expected, especially with that Senate race being closer than it was originally going to be, with Ron Johnson and Mandela Barnes being pretty competitive for that seat. Now we have a whole ton of polls from states that aren't going to be that close. Starting off with Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer leads by 6 points according to CBS News, and her polling average is now 11.2% as she continues to lead over Tudor Dixon. Gretchen Whitmer is going to win re-election. She won by 9.6% to her first term in 2018, and this race, which was initially going to be close, really has become a very solid race for Democrats. Gretchen Whitmer now ahead by 11.2%. Republicans have no chance at recapturing Michigan's governorship, so Michigan will be a likely Republican state. I think that she can win by double digits, but it's more likely that she wins by around 7 to 8. And we also have a new poll from Colorado, this one showing Jared Polis ahead of Heidi Gonnell by 17 points. Colorado continues to shift to the left, and so Jared Polis, as the only openly gay governor in the entire country, is ahead by 15 points for the first time ever against Gonnell, and so Gonnell is not going to win this election. The two latest polls have all shown Polis ahead by 17%, and so right now I'm going to move my rating for Colorado from likely to solid for the Democratic Party, and I'm currently betting on Jared Polis easily winning his re-election, just like he won his first term in 2018, where he defeated Stapleton by 10.6%. We also have a new poll from Iowa conducted by Emerson College. Kim Reynolds up by 17 points against Dedrick Jeer. The state of Iowa is not going to be close either. I mean, Iowa has been trending more and more to the right, just like Ohio, and so basically every single poll has shown Reynolds easily winning her second term in office, despite a very poor showing in 2018. She only won by less than 3% against Mike Hubbell, but this time Iowa is going to be solid red. And then in Rhode Island, this is the final poll from these states that I'm just going to go over pretty quickly because they really aren't competitive at all. But in Rhode Island, Dan McKee, who is barely renominated to be governor for a second time, is up by 13 points against Ashley Callis. And McKee only took office after Gina Raimondo resigned to become Biden's Secretary of Commerce. But in Rhode Island, now that he's won the nomination, Dan McKee is on track to easily winning re-election, and I do think he's going to win by a solid margin. And then in New York, Kathy Hochul only leads by 2 points against Lee Zeldin, despite this race being one that should be very solid for the Democratic Party. Kathy Hochul is the pretty unpopular incumbent governor who only took office after Andrew Cuomo was, of course, forced to resign, and since then she has had quite a bit of trouble maintaining high levels of popularity, and so that's why Lee Zeldin is running such an effective campaign. The top leadership in the Empire State has not been great over the last couple of years, and Republicans really are taking advantage of this fact, despite the Senate race being a win that will be very easy for Democrats, with Chuck Schumer being the Senate Majority Leader. The governor election is going to be much closer, and so that's why I have New York now as a likely Democratic state. It is no longer solid. Next up, we have polls from 2 of the most competitive races of the year. These, of course, being from both Nevada and Arizona, and both of these polls were conducted by CNN. So these polls were conducted with registered voters and then a smaller sample of likely voters. Basically, it's the 926 registered voters, and then for this poll here, they did not include any of the people that were not likely to vote, and that's how they got to 828. So according to this poll, if you look at the numbers based on registered voters, Democrats do better than based on likely voters, which Lombardo has a lead in Nevada, and then in Arizona, Katie Hobbs is only ahead by 3 points here, despite being ahead by 5 when you only look at registered voters alone, without considering how likely they are to vote. And this is a major issue for Democrats, and also something that is to be expected, as of course Democrats currently control the entirety of the national government, and so it would make sense for more Republicans to be more motivated to vote. And so right now in Nevada, Joe Lombardo has taken the lead for the very first time against Steve Sisolak since all the way back in early April, and this is a result of many of the latest polls showing either an even race or Joe Lombardo actually ahead. Trafalgar had Lombardo up by 3, and so this CNN poll is actually some better news for Steve Sisolak compared to the other polls, but right now I have Nevada as a tilt Republican state. I think that Steve Sisolak is in trouble, just like Catherine Cortez Masto is, as she attempts to win a second term in the Senate. Both Democrats are currently on track to losing, but this race is still going to be very close. Steve Sisolak is definitely still in the election. You cannot count him out as the incumbent governor, but things right now are trending very well for Republicans in the Silver State, and so that's why I have Nevada as a tilt Republican state on this map. However, I do feel a little bit differently about the Arizona election. I think that Kari Lake is just so much worse of a nominee than Joe Lombardo is in Nevada, and so in Arizona, I will actually give this state a tilt Democratic rating, with Katie Hobbs currently ahead by 0.2% in the polls. The polling recently has been okay for her, and of course, if you look at the polls from Marist College as well as the Trafalgar Group, they show only slight margins in favor of Lake. Trafalgar having Lake up by 4 is still not small, but of course, as a pollster known to heavily overestimate Republicans, this is not the worst news for the Hobbs campaign. I think that Katie Hobbs is doing okay right now. This race is going to be very close. Kari Lake can still definitely win. She has a very good chance of winning, but if I had to give a rating for the Arizona race right now, I would give it a tilt Democratic rating, with Kari Lake currently, I think, going to lose, simply because of the fact that she's branded herself as a very solid Trump Republican. In the peach state of Georgia, Brian Kemp leads by 6 and 2% against Stacey Abrams, according to the 2 most recent polls. And so the governor's race is really not going to be that exciting. Brian Kemp is going to win re-election despite only defeating Abrams by 1% back in 2018. This was one of the closest elections of the year. The only governor race that was close in this one was the one in Florida, where Ron DeSantis defeated Andrew Gillum by 0.4%. But this year, Brian Kemp is going to win re-election. There's no doubt about that. Stacey Abrams simply isn't doing as well as she was 4 years ago, and that is to be expected because of the national environment. Brian Kemp has basically led in every single poll for this election. You will see a few that show Stacey Abrams in the lead, but that's just by a 1-point margin, and these weren't exactly the best polls. These are both online pollsters that conducted the surveys, but Brian Kemp right now is definitely on track to winning re-election. However, in the Senate election, we're seeing some pretty bad news for Republicans, because if you look at these two most recent polls, Kemp +6, Kemp +2, the same polls for the Senate race showed Warnock ahead by 4 and 12%. After the scandal for Herschel Walker, in which he basically was accused of having asked for an abortion twice to an ex-girlfriend and somebody that actually gave birth to one of his children, Raphael Warnock's numbers have gone up pretty significantly. He now has a 2 in 3 chance at winning, according to the betting market, and is ahead by 3.7% in the polls. So the Senate race not trending well for Republicans, but in the gubernatorial election, Brian Kemp is on track to winning re-election most definitely, which is why I give it a likely Republican rating. Next up in Minnesota, Tim Walz is ahead by 10 points against Scott Jensen, according to the latest Survey USA poll. Walz defeated his Republican challenger in 2018 by double digits, and he's probably going to do that again. Jeff Johnson was not even close in that election, and so Tim Walz won his first term in office, but now he is expected to win by possibly a double-digit margin for a second time, despite the national environment, of course, being one that significantly favors Republicans a lot more than it did in 2018. And so Tim Walz is ahead by 9 points in the average. He has led in every single poll for this election. Even the Trafalgar Group and Scott Jensen's own campaign polls show Walz winning re-election, and so that's why Minnesota is going to be a likely Democratic state, just like Michigan. We also have a new poll from Florida. This was conducted back in late September. We're probably not going to see any polls from the state in the next couple of days as a result of course, Hurricane Ian and the destruction that has caused. Mainly, the issue here is that you won't be able to reach as many voters because people really aren't trying to answer polls at this point in time when they're recovering from a huge natural disaster. So Ron DeSantis leads by 11 points in this latest poll against Charlie Crist. I don't think that the hurricane is going to help Democrats here at all. I think that's only going to boost Ron DeSantis, as he just met with Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden isn't really going to help Ron DeSantis, but the fact that there is now a disaster, and a huge disaster, to even prompt the visit of the president means that voters are more likely to re-elect the leader, and that, of course, being Ron DeSantis, means that Florida, right now, I have as a likely Republican state. And then in the state of Vermont, we have the race between Brenda Siegel and Phil Scott. Scott is running for a 4th term. Governors in Vermont are re-elected every 2 years, and Scott leads by 17 points. In 2020, he won his 3rd term in office by a very wide 41-point margin. I think he's going to win by a pretty large margin once again, but probably not as big as his margin from 2020. That really was a very special election. I think Tim Scott or Phil Scott is going to win by possibly around 20 to 30 points, but still a very solid red considering that Vermont is actually the most Democratic state in the country. And now moving on to Oregon, Christine Drazan leads in another poll against Tina Kotek. Democrats are in trouble in the gubernatorial election in Oregon. Christine Drazan is now ahead by 1.2% in the polling. Betsy Johnson has dropped down to just 19.5%. But Tina Kotek, as a Democratic nominee, is really struggling to capture liberal support after 6 years of Kate Brown. Kate Brown is one of the least popular governors in the entire country, and she barely won her re-election in 2018, despite it being a very good year for Democrats in Oregon being a solid Democratic state. Kate Brown only managed a victory of 6.4% against her Republican challenger. She did win a 2nd term successfully, but now Tina Kotek is having to deal with her unpopularity as she runs in a year that's significantly less favorable for Democrats. Betsy Johnson is also taking a lot of the liberal vote. If she was not in this race, Tina Kotek would probably have a much better chance at winning. And so Republicans have not captured the governor's mansion in Oregon in over 3 decades, and this really is their best chance to do so, as Christine Drazan has led in basically every single poll released since the month of August, though by some very small margins. And so right now, I do expect Tina Kotek to outperform these expectations. I do still think she has a very slight advantage, but this election really could go both ways, and it's pretty surprising to say because it is from the state of Oregon. And then in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro leads by 11 points against Doug Mastriano. This is not going to be that competitive of a race at all. I mean, I've gone over Pennsylvania many times on this channel over the last couple of months. The Senate race may be close between Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman, despite Fetterman still being the clear favorite, but on the gubernatorial level, Josh Shapiro is going to win his election to a first term after 8 years of Tom Wolf. Tom Wolf was reelected by a solid margin back in 2018 with Fetterman as his lieutenant governor, and in 2014, even though it was a very bad year for Democrats, with Republicans capturing 31 governorships, Wolf still won by almost double digits. So Democrats have been doing pretty well in recent gubernatorial elections in the Keystone State, and I don't think Josh Shapiro is going to break that trend anytime soon, as Doug Mastriano is probably the worst Republican nominee for any governor election this year. Just look at all the polls released over the last couple of weeks. Every single one of them has Shapiro ahead by double-digit margins. I do think there's a very good chance that he does win by over 10 points, making Pennsylvania a race that's probably going to be more solid than Michigan and Minnesota. We also have some new polls from New Hampshire, and they all show Chris Sununu with a pretty solid lead over Tom Sherman. Now, in 2020, Tom Sherman was not the Democratic nominee, and instead, Democrats chose Dan Feltz, who lost by 32%. And so Chris Sununu was also reelected to a third term that year alongside Phil Scott. Governors in New Hampshire are also elected every 2 years, and so in 2022, Chris Sununu is probably going to win by a much smaller margin, but still a very impressive victory considering the fact that New Hampshire is a state that does lean in favor of the Democrats. And so despite this race getting closer and closer, Chris Sununu is easily on track to winning re-election, and so the state of New Hampshire is still going to be a solid Republican state on my map. And finally, we have a new poll from the state of California. We've already gone over the polls from both Nevada and Florida, as well as the poll from Michigan, but in California, Gavin Newsom leads by 21% against Brian Dale. Newsom, of course, survived his recall election earlier last year, I believe in September of 2021. He won that pretty easily with over 60% support, and so he's going to win re-election this time to a second term after winning by a very solid margin back in 2018. He won by 24 points against Dan Cox. He's probably going to win by a similar margin in 2022, as basically that's what the polls are currently suggesting. Gavin Newsom is on track to winning re-election, which makes California a solid Democratic state. And so with additional input from these new polls, this is what the 2022 governor's map looks like. We have some pretty close races in Oregon, Arizona, and Wisconsin. Kansas, I've not filled in. We don't have polls here, and it's going to be very, very close. But right now, I do have it as being tilted Democratic, with Laura Kelly winning her re-election. And so today we did change some ratings though, especially in Nebraska and Oklahoma. Pretty surprising to see these races move down into the likely Republican column. And of course, Democrats also aren't doing too well in some races as well, especially in New York, where Kathy Hochul is seriously struggling to even win by double digits. But in these tilt races, it very much could go both ways. But at this point, this is what I have these states categorized as. I think the Democrats do have the advantage in most of these races, but I would not be surprised if they won less than 24 governorships in November. But right now, this is just a snapshot of the 2022 governor's map with, of course, input from these latest polls. We're going to get more and more polls, and so subscribe to my channel, stay updated. I'll keep you guys well informed on the 2022 midterms, as we are now less than 30 days away. Like this video down below if you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in the next video.